Evidence Not Seen, Darlene Deibler Rose. In May of 1943, 5 months after our deportation from Bintang, Miss Seeley saw one of our Makassar friends while collecting rations at the native market in Molino. He relayed the news that Ernie and Russell were no longer Makassar. This was already known. No one had been able to learn anything further about our husbands since the civilian men's camp had been relocated in Para. Standing in the lean-to cooking and stoking the fire one day, I picked up a familiar clump of soldiers' feet. Hastening to the nearest window, I called in, "Soldiers! They're headed this way!" With a great pretense of surprise at seeing them, I obeyed when a soldier motioned me into the house. The one whose Indonesian was the least bad gave us instructions to pack. We were restricted in how much we could take. There would be no carriers this time. The soldiers continued on to the other houses to inform our neighbors to pack. We ran to the cooking lean-to, doused the fire, then hastened inside to pack. Wearing all my lingerie and 4 dresses, one over the other, I made room for other things in the briefcase. Arriving in Molino just before sunset, we were ordered to go to the church where we would spend the night. The church was already filled to capacity with people in their luggage. We found places for Dr. and Mrs. Jaffrey on a pew. It was a hard bed, but at least they could stretch out after the long, exhausting march of the afternoon. The rest of us tried to make ourselves comfortable on a pew or the floor in a close proximity as was possible, lest we become separated when soldiers started loading the trucks. All that long night we could hear the rumble of arriving enemy trucks and the screech of brakes as they stopped alongside the church. There was little sleep for any of us. Little ones clung to their mothers and bewailed the unnatural, uncomfortable atmosphere. Fear is infectious. Now I understood why the Lord had instructed the army leaders in Deuteronomy to send home the soldiers who were fearful, lest they cause the others' hearts to faint as well. The children, sensing the fear of their mothers, cried for what they did not understand, while their mothers cried for what they did understand, that all our lives hung by a very slender thread. We were at the mercy of capricious, unprincipled men. Some of the women were leaving behind graves. They clutched their small bundles to them and rocked back and forth, cheeks wet with tears, eyes closed, voices mute with sorrow too fresh to be expressed audibly. My Lord, do you not hear the cries of the little ones? Who will be their defense? Rise up and avenge us of our enemy. It was a night in mournful Kadesh, grieving for what had been, was no more, would never be again. Weeping endured the long night through, followed by a morning from which joy had fled. My head pillowed on the briefcase, I studied the faces of those around me. Fingers of first light had reached through the windows, and softly within my heart I began to sing. In the glow of early morning and the solemn hush of night, down from heaven's open portals steals a messenger of light, whispering sweetly to my spirit while the host of heaven sing, this the wondrous thrilling story, Christ is coming, Christ my King. Oft methinks I hear his footsteps stealing down the paths of time, and the future dark with shadows brightens with this hope sublime. Sound the soul-inspiring anthem, angel hosts, your harps attune. Earth's long night is almost over. Christ is coming, coming soon. Yes, come, Lord Jesus, come quickly. And I listened for his footsteps, for never during our imprisonment thus far had the future been darker or the shadows deeper. It had now been more than a year since Russell and I were separated, more than 6 months since there had been any definite news concerning him. Every move meant greater separation. Now where? Unless we were to be taken to Makassar, where besides Molino could they find housing for more than 1,000 women and children? I touched Ruth and suggested that some of us should go to the makeshift washrooms while others watched the luggage. Dr. Jaffrey, the early riser, was already awake. We checked and arranged our baggage so that nothing should be left behind, then distributed Dr. and Mrs. Jaffrey's personal belongings among us. Breakfast was a meager portion of bread. A truck roared to life, frightening the children into wakefulness. People began to mill about. Little ones strayed from their mothers. When the moment of realization came that they were lost, they began to scream, "Motor! Motor! Mother!" It was pandemonium. Other drivers started to warm up the engines of their trucks, drowning out the sounds of human misery. The loading began without consideration for the elderly, the infirm, or mothers with children. Those who had been in Milano were apprehensive lest one of the officers be the former owner of Kaniko's variety store. He had reappeared as a captain in the army. He made a great production of beating all the women he felt had been rude to him while he was masquerading as a shopkeeper. Everyone walked softly before him in his true role as army officer. A fixed bayonet and prior knowledge of our captors were great persuaders. The trucks were loaded. Much prayer was made that no one would be thrown out of the stake bed truck. It had no tailgate. Those of us who could secure a firm hold on a support rail allowed those in the center of the truck bed to hang on to us. We held our bags between our feet. The drivers whipped around bends with no regard for the human cargo. They slammed on their brakes to throw us against one another. The abrupt starts were the worst, however. We dreaded that a child or elderly woman would be wantonly tossed off the end. The sun had no pity on us either. The heat became oppressive as we reached sea level, and we were all candidates for sunstroke. I felt bruised, battered, and at the boiling point. I and my 4 dresses and layers of lingerie. Things began to look familiar. We turned off the main road and drove along between sawas, flooded rice fields. To the right, we saw a large moat with a barbed wire fence on the far side. So this is it, Campili, the native tuberculosis sanitarium. Everyone nodded, too exhausted to speak. The driver turned to cross the moat and bring the truck to an abrupt stop inside the barbed wire enclosure. Those near the back jumped down to help others. I experienced the sentiment expressed in the spiritual. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child a long way from home. Iowa was never like this. The area, denuded of vegetation, was a plain of red clay cluttered with partially completed structures resembling Dayak longhouses, except that they weren't standing on piles. To the right were the cement houses of the sanitarium. We were herded toward the farthest block of 6 barracks. The first 4 buildings were complete. Barracks 5 and 6 were nearing completion. A young Chinese was inspecting the work of his crew of carpenters. I saw him speak to a Dutch woman, who turned and pointed directly at me. I nearly swallowed my tonsils from shock. I had never seen the man before. Steadily moving in my direction, he gave suggestions here and there to the workmen. One complete turn, presumably to inspect the building, told him that there were no Japanese in sight, so he boldly handed me a letter, saying it was from my friend, Wiesjace, and did we need anything. I crumpled the letter into my hand and, turning to look at Margaret Jaffrey so that the Chinese and I would not appear to be talking together, I thanked him and Wiesjace, but urged, please, not to risk another letter. It was far too dangerous for them both. Come, Margaret, let's find some place where I can get out of these clothes, or I'm going to die of heat exhaustion. Did you ever see a place that reminded you more of the abomination of desolation than this? We found a block of toilets at the back of the barracks. Margaret stood guard as there were no doors, and workmen were everywhere. 1, 2, 3, 4, off came the dresses, then the redundant lingerie. It was such a welcome relief. Margaret and I then read Wiesjace's expression of the family's concern. She wrote that if we were in need of anything, we should tell Sui. He was a good friend and we could trust him. This is appreciated, but we hadn't the slightest intention of endangering their lives. With the letter stashed inside my clothes, we joined the rest of our group. I would need to find a fire where I could dispose of the letter after the others had read it. We learned that people from Ambon and nearby islands had been brought to Campili after their camp in Ambon had been bombed by the Allies. Many had died or been injured as a result of the bombing. The survivors of the bombing were all billeted in the cement houses that had been part of the former tuberculosis sanatorium. Dr. Jaffrey was directed to one of these cement houses where he would be lodged with the other men and all boys over 16. As soon as the trucks carrying the construction men left for Makassar, we were told to choose a place to sleep in Barrack 6. We first examined our barracks. The walls of these half-block-long structures were woven bamboo mats. Their steep hip roofs were covered with grass and the floors with bare dirt. Extending down both sides were double-decked double-decker bamboo sleeping racks. There was a space between the top of the wall and the roof, providing light by day and a cross-draft at all times. How much human tragedy or triumph these barracks at Campili would witness was a question that time alone could answer. With the prospect of moving ahead of us, we made no attempt to settle in. The sanatorium kitchen, which we experienced for the first time that night, had been enlarged to facilitate cooking for the whole camp. We had some skilled cooks who knew how to artfully use spices and make them palatable.